So, if you've been paying attention to my Twitter, or at the very least it showed up on your feed, you may know that I released a tweet telling people to go and rewatch the Scott Cawthon interview 2.0 by Daco that released just this September for the anniversary, or August. And a lot of people obviously asked why I specifically asked for people to go and rewatch this video, and at the time, I did have a specific reason for why I was asking people to go and rewatch it, and that is specifically due to a lot of comments that I've been getting on my two videos talking about Tales games being confirmed, and how a lot of people are getting confused. So I wanted to actually sit here and tell you guys exactly what information was really important to get from this video, and I would highly suggest that if you don't want to sit here and listen to me ramble on about it, that I'm going to put Daco's interview in both the description and at the end of this video, and I would highly suggest you just go and watch it yourself. There's a lot of important information stated inside of it, and I feel like a lot of people have just forgotten about all of the information that was stated inside of it. But for today's specific argument, I wanted to discuss things involving Tales games. I saw that there was some confusion. Tales games is not in reference to the Tales books being made into games. Simply, it refers to the Tales from the Pizzaplex games or books being inside of the game's timeline. It's been a fairly popular idea, especially because of the previous one, that being Frights games or Stitchline, the belief that those books were going to be canon, and that eventually led to a lot of people assuming Tales was going to be canon. And at the time, it was in a weird event, whereas the events of Frights actually recovered things, so a lot of people thought that it was parallels, because a lot of people were already set on, well, Mike's the Fright Guard. This series says the Fright Guard is Hudson, whoever the hell that is, so of course this has to be like a parallel. This is a parallel to Mike. And then they slowly went through each little story and noticing small details and realizing, oh, these are just stories that are paralleling them. However, I don't think that's the case. I've stated this before in an old video that I made. It was roughly before I started on this whole I Solved Five Nights at Freddy's little spiel I've been on, in which I stated that the events of the books, they're a little weird. And while I understand that a lot of people don't like them because they're weird, that ultimately doesn't make it to where they can't be considered canon. I have often seen the argument of, well, you wouldn't want Impreg and Phasgoo. Why would you want Phasgoo and Sea Bonnies? Those aren't canon. Those are so stupid. But as I stated in a comment, that's just not how it works. If you guys watched the interview, you distinctly would notice that Scott Cawthon said that he wrote every single one of those stories. He said that he wrote 10 to 15 pages and then gave them to authors to flesh out. And ultimately, that means that all of those stories were things that Scott chose to add to his franchise. Those are stories written by him. They're not stories written by Scholastic. They're stories written by him that were then edited by Scholastic writers. And that's an important detail, because a lot of people like to take information such as Susie having brown hair and coming home, or the specific details here and there throughout the series that have not been 100% accurate to the events that take place inside of the games. And so often people use that as a gotcha. Clearly they can't take place in the game's timeline. And often it's usually compared to the trilogy, the Five Nights at Freddy's trilogy, and I've often heard people say, well, the trilogy is not supposed to be used as in continuity, so obviously these books shouldn't be used as in continuity either. However, I think that's incredibly redundant. Scott Cawthon created the trilogy specifically for the purpose of recovering the events of the games inside of a story format. I feel like if Scott wanted to cover a lot of those events, especially considering that they were post-FFPS, that at any moment Scott could have just written them to be actual stories in the Silver Eyes trilogy. There was really nothing stopping him from making the stories part of the Silver Eyes, making it a side story to the trilogy, mentioning Charlie and the others that were inside of the trilogy, and having it be having the books be a separate continuity if that's what he wanted. But it's not what he did. Instead, inside of the books, we're never actually given a build-up for who these characters are, what these locations locations are. These are just small little stories that are set place inside of these locations and with these people that we know from the games. It makes no mention of specific things that have never made their way into other continuities or into the game continuity. A lot of people like to use such as Ella being a doll inside of FNAF Frights as a gotcha. Oh, well, Ella was inside of the novels. But the thing is that Ella is also inside of the movie. So at the end of the day, the fact that it's appeared in multiple continuities at this point means that it is a continuity, it is a canon piece of information. It exists in all continuities. That is usually how continuities work. He specifically even stated that to be the way that canon works. Obviously, the books or the novels are not in continuity because they have continuity errors. They physically cannot take place without causing a bunch of retcons to the previously established story. Whereas FNAF Frights has very small little details that ultimately don't mess with the continuity all that much. A lot of people like to think it does because it ultimately ends up going against all of their beliefs, or at least some of their beliefs, when it comes to the modern day Five Nights at Freddy's lore. A lot of people didn't want FNAF Frights to be a canon piece of information, or at the very least in continuity, because that would establish that William Afton can't be Glitchtrap, which is inherently untrue, as it is perfectly capable for William Afton to somehow survive the explosion. I don't think it's that far-fetched to believe that he could have just gotten onto a chunk of metal from the agony and got picked up by Fazbear Entertainment. I don't believe that's what happened, but it's still a plausible reality, and ultimately that makes your argument a little invalid, you know? And when it comes to those things, I feel like that's the majority of the reason why people don't want the books to be canon, because it ultimately goes against a lot of established theories within the theorist community, and people don't like messing around with that stuff that could end up causing everyone to have to take their theories and change them. And I understand that's a difficult thing to do. However, we saw this same exact reaction when Dream Theory ended up being untrue. I've seen a lot of comments saying that Scott Cawthon deliberately changed the story so that way Dream Theory wouldn't be true, when that's inherently false. That was a narrative created by the theorist community in a way to try and salvage their own identity in order to make themselves not look like they made a mistake. And it wasn't even MatPat himself who even claimed for that to be the case. Of course, he still does believe that Dream Theory at some point was either both a really good theory or potentially even canon, but I don't think MatPat would go on the limb and say, oh, Scott intentionally changed the story so that way I was wrong. Not even Matt would say something like that. It's incredibly gross to do that kind of behavior, because at the end of the day, a theory is not a fact. It doesn't matter how much evidence you have for said theory. At the end of the day, if Scott Cawthon decides that that's not the direction he wants his story to go, that's not the direction that his story is going to go. One of the biggest pieces of evidence that is inside of the Scott Cawthon interview, he specifically mentions the box, which is a piece of information people have been trying to solve for years, and even I have been really ignorant and still continue to use the box, even just videos from a few weeks ago. And I know that got a lot of people angry because Scott already said that no, there is nothing in the box. The box did have contents, but he doesn't know what they are, and that's no longer a valid piece of evidence. I think that's incredibly stupid, because that feels like something Scott should have told us a long time ago, and we all know that both in the interview and from communicating with him on Reddit, that Scott has had a communication issue for years. This isn't something new. Scott has a bit of a bad time actually explaining to people what can and cannot be used within inside of this series. It just seems a little silly that he kind of kept that information from the theorist community for so long, when in reality it would have been pretty nice to not waste our times on something that inherently had no purpose. But at the end of the day, it still continued to let the theorists just assume what was inside of the box. It kept people talking about Five Nights at Freddy's. And I understand why he would do that. But I do think that something needed to change, and even he admitted in the interview that things needed to change, that there needs to be a stronger communication between the people inside of the community who just want to follow the story and the people that are outside of the people who control the story. We need to be able to know what we can and cannot use, otherwise theorizing is not physically possible. At the end of the day, if we're trying to assume what pieces of evidence we can and cannot use, then at the end of the day, Scott could just pull the rug from underneath us and say, well, actually, this certain piece of information also isn't relevant anymore. I mean, one of the other pieces of evidence that a lot of people never really talk about much anymore is at the end of the security logbook, there's specifically a picture of this scrap-like Chica, which never ended up being anything. There are theories that this is actually Chica from What We Found, suggesting that it leads directly into the FNAF Frights series. Some people think that maybe it's a lost bit from FFPS and that the animatronics weren't originally going to be inside of the Funtime animatronics. And those are all fine and dandy theories to have out there, but at the end of the day, I wouldn't be all too surprised if Scott just decided, oh, that was a piece of information that I wasn't using anymore, and we'd never know because he hasn't actually given us any information on it. And that can be incredibly annoying and aggravating, and wanting to leave the community over something like that is completely reasonable. But when it comes to the information that he's given us, he has deliberately stated in both several Steam posts, Reddit posts, etc., he has stated that when it comes to future information, he tries to make sure that he gets people on track. That's why with all of these details coming out that seem to suggest Tales games, it just gets a little silly when people try to deny that it's not the case that it really does look like. And of course, I'm not here to sit here and say that creators who don't believe that should be harassed or anything like that. I specifically made a video discussing how that's incredibly gross. I'm talking about the actual idea and how it's kind of without merit, and how I would be perfectly fine getting into an argument about how that currently trying to believe that Scott would deliberately continue to put pieces of evidence in front of our face that say, hey, Tales Games is canon, just to reveal that it's not canon would be incredibly aggravating. I mean, can you imagine if somebody just sat there and did that with any other franchise ever? If people were dangling this piece of information in front of your eyes, saying, oh, look at this thing that everyone keeps arguing about, pay attention to this, and then it's revealed that, oh, no, it wasn't anything. It was just a goof, you know? Oh, we just created a bunch of different continuities for the sake of it, because ultimately that's what a lot of people are arguing at this point, because we have things like the Into the Pit game. Are you suggesting that we have a games continuity, an Into the Pit games continuity, and an Into the Pit book continuity? Don't you think it's a little silly how we have continuity over continuity over continuity? I understand that in other franchises that's probably the normality, but I think it's a little silly when people are sitting here saying, hey, we want an answer to whether or not these things should be used as evidence for theorizing, just to be handed a bunch of other pieces of information from alternate continuities. Don't you think that's kind of a dickhead move? I mean, ultimately, when you see these things, books being made into games, you see games being made into books, see The Week Before, you see details of book characters who have never been mentioned in the games once, being dragged over into the game's timeline. How is anyone from the game's timeline supposed to know who Edwin Murray is, or who the Mimic is, and what created them? Of course, you can rely on theorists to try and tell you what's going on there, but ultimately, an awful lot of theorists within the community have an agenda that they're trying to push when it comes to those sorts of theories. Ultimately, a lot of people aren't going to go and read the books to find out who those characters actually are. And at the end of the day, that is flat out saying, hey, you need to read the books to know about this game information. And you would think, when it comes to that, you would think that that would imply, hey, these books are in the game's continuity because they're important enough that you cannot get the story complete without them. There is in no way, shape, or form to know who Edwin Murray or Tiger Rock or who created the Mimic without reading those books. You can theorize about how it could potentially be a parallel, but let's be blatantly honest, nothing within the games ever suggested the existence of a Mimic. It's only when the books introduced the Mimic that we got a character called the Mimic. It's just a really silly situation that we continuously do this over and over and over again. I know that there's a big problem currently on the Twitter community over the Tiger Rock plush, and how, well, it has one blue eye and an orange eye, so clearly this isn't the gotcha. Which, guys, can we be serious for a second? Can we actually be serious for a second? Do you really think that Steelwool sat there and thought, you know, how would we determine that this is an alternate continuity? We could either not add Tiger Rock whatsoever, any sort of reference to them, to the games, or we can change an eye color. That'll make people realize. Only one eye color though. We're not going to change the other. And it's not like people could easily misinterpret this as coloring on the image being wrong. Guys, let's not even get into the fact that this is specifically a stuffed animal, which inside of the books is never referred to of having green or blue eyes. So its eye color does not matter. We're arguing to the air. There is no argument to be made here. I understand that when it comes to things, you can say that yes, it's not 100% confirmed that these things are going to happen, but at the end of the day, when you keep piling up information after information suggesting, hey, this is what's going on, it's just incredibly irresponsible to do that and then expect people to be completely okay when it turns out that no, actually, the books were never canon. We were just continuously giving you this information to make it seem like the books were canon, just because we liked those characters, I guess. It's just an incredibly annoying situation, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you guys that we should never discuss this ever again, but I would suggest that after this point, there will be no debating. There will be no debating, because be the bigger person and admit, hey, we've had all the information that we need to prove Tales games is canon. So if anyone tries to argue that it's not, it's just not an argument worth fighting. There's no point in us continuously yelling at each other over something that's fairly clearly not going to convince anybody. If all of the evidence that we've seen so far is not enough to convince somebody that, hey, the Tales books are in the game's continuity, then they're never going to be convinced ever. They need to be willing to actually look into the books and finding out this information, not just arguing. Arguing gets us nowhere. Arguing leads to people getting hurt. Arguing leads to creators being targeted and being harassed. So just stop. We're done. It's over. We've had enough evidence to say Tales games is canon. At this point, if you don't believe that it's canon, that's okay, but just step away from the argument. Because you know that there is enough evidence out there to convince somebody that it's canon. You're fighting an uphill battle. It's not going to win anyone over. That's all I wanted to say. It was, I think there's a lot of good information inside of the Scott Cawthon interview that a lot of people need to listen to, but that was most notably the points that I needed to discuss, because those are some things that are incredibly important. Scott Cawthon has put in information inside of the series that he has completely abandoned because at the time it made sense, that's what the story was going to be, and he ended up changing course. And I think that when it comes to things like the books, it's completely possible that it's the same exact situation, where Scott never intended for this book series to exist, but now that it does, he does want to intertwine them with the games. But again, you believe what you want to believe. I'm just a theorist to sit here and tell you what I believe, and I'll leave it up to you to decide what you want to believe. Don't harass people, stop the arguments, and I'll see you guys again soon. Matane.